Public diplomacy is an engagement with those within the society who influence opinion, as well as with the society as a whole. Diplomatic outreach in these days of social media can be instantaneous and very extensive. The new media has ushered in a democratization of information. An individual can communicate directly with a large audience. Whether in Tehran or Cairo, young people have used social media to enlist followers for their progressive causes. In some cases, one single image circulated widely can alter the course of events. The power of social media was evident during the Maidan movement in Ukraine. It started with a social media post, and social media was crucial in drawing people to the protests and facilitating communication during that time. By the same token, social media can be used negatively. ISIS is using social media to recruit followers to perpetrate nefarious acts of terror. You are very familiar with Russian disinformation campaigns using manipulated state-controlled media. Repressive governments in China and elsewhere are always trying to limit the use of social media by activists because they cannot control it. But they are also using it themselves to spread inaccuracies. It is important to remember that these new technologies are in themselves neutral. They can be used to promote democratic values, human rights, and civil liberties, or they can be used by radical extremists to promote violence. They can be used to spread the word about protests against oppression, or they can be used by repressive regimes to promote injustice through propaganda. During the Cold War, the world was divided into two spheres. There was a clearly defined struggle between two ideologies, capitalism and communism. The US and the USSR waged a propaganda war through television, radio, and the press. I would guess that there are some among you today in the audience who would have learned about world events by listening to the BBC or Radio Free Europe at the time when the media in the USSR was under government control. Today, governments are faced in many cases with trying to counteract the messages disseminated by stateless and faceless actors. These actors are using social media as a primary means of communication, an important political tool, as you well know, in Ukraine. Depending on the particular situation, messages may contain criticism of authoritarian regimes, calls for Islamic jihad, or advocacy of separatist or ethnic divisions, or opposition to political opinions. In other words, for good or bad. The instruments of communication have proliferated to the extent that it is impossible to monitor them. A lonely young woman living in a trailer park in Wyoming, in a remote part of the US, can be propagandized by soft-spoken extremists based in the UK. We have only to consider the large number of people across Europe who have gone to join ISIS in Syria to see the potential negative effects of the new technologies. On the other hand, these technologies have contributed to the creation of a global economy and advances in the practical applications of scientific discoveries that benefit all mankind. Cultural diplomacy is one of the most significant ways in which a government can promote its interests in the world. For you here in Ukraine, of course, the most immediate concerns would be communications with the countries of the EU, Russia, of course, and the US. Ukraine can use cultural diplomacy to foster international dialogue and promote a positive image of the country in the global arena. If under the rubric of cultural diplomacy we include academic and professional and cultural exchange programs, conferences and lectures on political, economic, and social issues, literary readings, films, theatrical productions, art exhibitions, dance and musical performances, it's obvious that there are a wide range of platforms available to enable constructive dialogue and to create positive images. The existence of digital media conferencing, podcasts, and other means of interactive communication make it possible to considerably enhance the impact of a single program. Media events provide an excellent forum for a country like Ukraine to draw on its shared cultural and moral values with other European states to elicit support for its policies. The new technologies are instruments of communication, just as were the telephone, the radio, and television before them. The exertion of influence starts and ends with people, and I was happy to hear that reiterated quite a few times in the two excellent panels preceding this talk. It is important to remember that nothing can replace people-to-people exchange. For example, in every country in which I served as a diplomat, those who came forward first to assist me in identifying and meeting the most influential people in the society were invariably those who had participated in our Fulbright, international visitor or youth exchange programs. We made an investment in them that enabled them to study or travel in the US, and I've already met a few people here in Kiev who participated in these programs, I'm happy to say. When the time came, they wanted to give back. In addition, those who had lived for a year or more in the US were able to act as cultural translators. Every society has its manners and peculiarities, its cultural values, its taboos. To be an effective diplomat, it is essential to develop that level of cultural empathy in the first days of an assignment in a new country. And remember, all of you Ukrainians, when you go out in the world, whether you are traditional official diplomats or just people representing other organizations, you are representing your country. People will draw conclusions about your country from the things that you say and do. So a top priority should be given to this investment in people. Media is important, but people and face-to-face contact are even more effective. And of course, the two should be combined. Remember, too, that exchange is a two-way street. Young Ukrainians should go abroad, but it is important also to invite others to visit Ukraine. Keep in mind that the talented young student from France or Germany who visits Ukraine may one day be a government minister or an editor of a major newspaper in his or her country. The Ukrainian scholar who studies abroad in Italy, for example, is a cultural ambassador for Ukraine in that country, but that young scholar could one day become an important analyst of Italian politics for the Ukrainian government. Cultural diplomacy, as we heard many, many times over and over earlier, is a form of soft power. There is no question that soft power must be backed by military power to have credibility. The purpose of soft power is to diffuse conflicts before they happen, so that the use of military force can be avoided unless absolutely necessary. Soft power, as defined by Professor Joseph Nye, and we heard quite a bit about him already, is based on attraction. A democratic political system is attractive. Others want to have it. A sound economy is attractive. Others want to have it. A tolerant society in which people of every race, religion, and ethnicity live together and peace and harmony is attractive. Others want to have it. A society that fosters creativity and innovation is attractive. Others want to have it. All these characteristics can be promoted through cultural diplomacy. Aside from exchange programs, conferences that explore the most challenging issues of the moment, as for example, what to do about the refugee crisis in Europe, provide a forum in which assessments and solutions can be openly discussed. Speaker programs are another element of cultural diplomacy. When experts from Ukraine address foreign audiences, they provide insights into conditions here but they also take home other perspectives as a result of the questions posed to them by their listeners abroad. This works both ways. Experts whom you invite here will not only share their knowledge with you, they will also return to their own countries with a deeper understanding of the situation in Ukraine, and that's been my personal experience even in this short visit. That understanding may lead to progress in many different ways in the future, when issues of the current day have been solved or abated, but the understanding and the familiarity created by the initial contact can bring other benefits. As a practitioner, I have frequently encountered in new situations other diplomats with whom I had previously worked. It is important when inviting speakers and experts, even if their views are at variance with official policy, to allow them to express their views freely. It is important to promote the concepts of intellectual freedom and open debate. As a diplomat present at the event, you can always outline the official policy for the audience. In recent times, one of the most important elements of cultural diplomacy, the arts, has been, to some extent, neglected. During the Cold War, the US was sending the Martha Graham Dance Company and many others on global tours. American classical and jazz orchestras were performing abroad. Music and dance were particularly powerful instruments for reaching the hearts as well as the minds of people around the world because, as was said earlier, they transcend language and touch upon the deepest and most profound sentiments in the human spirit. Literary readings and theatrical performances can have an enormous impact, particularly in societies where the press is not free. The performance of a play by Arthur Miller or even George Bernard Shaw can be truly subversive because it addresses issues metaphorically. There's a distinction to be made between the use of public diplomacy to direct issues in a very specific way and the use of cultural events to address issues metaphorically. Euripides' play, The Trojan Women, maintains its pacifist and pro-women message as much today as it has throughout the centuries. Audiences in such situations draw their own conclusions and apply circumstances in the play to their own society. The US did this because we had the Alvin Ailey Dance Company with its modern repertoire and African American performers. The Russians at the time, and I'm referring to the days of the Cold War, had the Bolshoi. While we had Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington, the Russians had Tchaikovsky. While we had Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, William Faulkner, the Russians had Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. In each of these instances, America demonstrated its ability to use the talents of its various ethnicities in new and original ways. Both jazz and classical music are wonderful art forms, but jazz is improvisational, and it says something about those creative elements in our culture that are also responsible for innovations in science and technology. There's a connection between music and Palo Alto, let's say. Jazz music came about when newly arrived immigrants from all parts of Eastern Europe encountered the rich blues tradition of the African Americans. It represents a fusion of African and European musical traditions that came about when the various strains met in New York and New Orleans and elsewhere in the United States, St. Louis, Chicago, and elsewhere. At the same time, virtuosity in the artistic and scientific arenas of the other can have an impressive impact. When the young American Van Cliburn won the first international Tchaikovsky competition in Moscow in 1958, it caused a global sensation, as had the Soviet launching of the Sputnik satellite a year earlier in 1957, and some of these lessons can be applied today. During the Cold War, the focus was always on Russia. It was because the USSR projected itself culturally through Russian art, by which, that is to say, claiming the arts and the productivity of everything in the Soviet sphere. When a musician or a dancer from Ukraine or Azerbaijan or Central Asia or elsewhere in the Soviet sphere of influence performed in New York, that artist was perceived to be Russian. It is now a great challenge for the newly independent and democratic nations of the former Soviet Union and its satellite states to project their own distinctive cultures through their literature, music, painting, and dance. Although technology has enabled us to talk with one another across the world without leaving our own homes or offices, it is also absolutely essential, wherever possible, to have venues for meetings. Many countries have cultural centers in major cities around the world, and of course this was just discussed. These centers, even if just what we now call American corners, enable people to come together on a person-to-person basis. In these meetings, views and opinions are often exchanged in a way that would not occur in a digital video conference, valuable though that technology truly is. The meeting place need not be the equivalent of the Alliance Française or the Goethe Institute. It can be the ambassador's residence. The German Consul General in New York holds a series of New York-Berlin salons in her living room. One American ambassador I worked for held a distinguished speaker series in his home. And of course, it can be a less formal or official setting in a university, a public hall, or a community center. It's necessary when funds are short, as was discussed at some length here, to be very inventive and creative in terms of finding venues. The importance of these programs is not just the dialogue that takes place between the speaker and the audience, it is also the networking within the audience itself. If Ukrainian experts on climate and energy issues come together with a European expert on that topic, they will also meet one another again so that the event has a significant multiplier effect. How would a public diplomacy officer at the Ukrainian embassy in some other country adapt these techniques? The first and most important step is to outline the priorities. What are the essential political, economic, and social issues of the moment for relations with that other country? Which Ukrainians can best communicate on these issues? What audience is to be reached? Is this a message for a specialized group of experts, or does it involve projection of an image of Ukraine for the larger public? The venue could be the ambassador's dining room or a public hall. The program could be off the record, enabling everyone to speak his mind freely, and there are certainly occasions when that's appropriate. It could be a panel discussion for journalists and think tank experts who would write about it for the larger readership, or it could be a webcast in which a self-selecting audience takes part. Another important consideration is the messenger. There are formal policy messages that are best communicated by Foreign Service officers or other government officials. These are cases in which the language must be very precise and convey accurately the official position of the government. There are cases in which a recognized non-government expert on the topic would be best. And finally, when it comes to exerting influence, sometimes it is best to use a local interlocutor. Let's take, for example, an extremely controversial topic, and I'm using this simply as an example, such as the vaccination of children against polio in Pakistan. The Taliban have been killing the local and international medical personnel who administer the vaccine. They are promoting propaganda that the vaccine is harmful. As a result, polio has not been eradicated there and has now even spread from there to Africa. Since the Western world is distrusted, only credible local voices can challenge the dangerous assertion that children should not be vaccinated. The dilemma, of course, is that very courageous local voices are needed in these circumstances. This is a case where it may be necessary to win over an extremely popular cultural figure to promote a program such as the vaccination program. How can cultural diplomacy be used for conflict resolution? The first thing we must recognize is that while each conflict is unique, all conflicts have some commonalities. There are religious, ethnic, and social fissures in all societies, including my own. The very worst conflict in American history in terms of loss of life was not the First or Second World War. It was our own bitter and devastating Civil War fought between 1861 and 1865. The division was regional. The war was fought between the industrialized North and the agricultural South. The most immediately divisive issue was slavery. The North wanted to abolish the use of slaves brought forcibly from Africa to work on Southern plantations, although it must be said that Northern shipping companies had profited enormously from this abominable practice. The larger issue had to do with the concept of states' rights as opposed to the federal government. In the end, the South was defeated and the practice of slavery came to an end, and the Union remained firm. Over a century later, the US elected President Barack Obama in 2008 and again in 2012. But we know in the United States that we still have much more to do to overcome racial and religious prejudice. Some of the most intractable and divisive conflicts are the result of the partitions created in the wake of the fall of the British Empire. India and Pakistan, Northern Ireland, Cyprus, Israel and the Palestinians. Historically, empires had a way of transcending ethnic rivalries by incorporating various religious and ethnic minorities into one larger identity. The Ottomans had something called the millet system, in which an overarching civil authority governed public life, while private matters, birth, marriage, divorce, inheritance, were the subject of the law of each respective confession. The rules for divorce and inheritance, for example, would be different from Muslims, Christians, and Jews. The British adopted a similar system in the Indian subcontinent, and it might be said that this was also true in Yugoslavia under Ottoman and later Austro-Hungarian rule. When these empires collapsed, there was a tendency to emphasize each of the religious and ethnic identities in a nationalistic way to the exclusion of the others. People who would have identified themselves as Yugoslav found that they were now Croatian or Serbian or Bosniak, despite extensive intermarriage in medium-sized towns as well as larger urban centers such as Sarajevo. So what are the commonalities in most conflicts? In the case in which a conflict divides into two groups, it can usually be said that one group is larger or stronger than the other, although historically the opposite might have been true and given rise to a perceived history of mistreatment. When the conflict is resolved, it is often difficult to ensure that the side that was formerly oppressed does not apply oppression in a similar fashion to the weaker. It is usually the case that the weaker side will demonize the stronger with negative stereotyping, while the stronger side will not feel it necessary to do so. Let's take, and I'm intentionally not in this presentation talking about Ukraine, I'm talking about other countries where I've worked in conflict resolution. Let's take the Irish Republic, for example. Historically, under British rule, the Catholics were oppressed. With the creation of the Republic, it became incumbent upon the Catholic majority to deal in a generous way with the Protestant minority that had formerly ruled it. This inclusivity and restraint were very much characterizing the 100th anniversary of the 1916 Easter Uprising, demonstrating what a long way the Irish Republic had come in terms of healing its ancient wounds. The fascinating thing about the Good Friday Peace Agreement in Northern Ireland is that it involved four partners: the Irish Protestants, the Irish Catholics in the North, as well as the UK and the Irish Republic. While imperfect, it is a diplomatic success story. What role can cultural diplomacy play in conflict resolution? Here I will draw upon my own experiences in conflict situations around the world and hope that some of these lessons can be applied in Ukraine's global diplomacy. And by the way, I was very happy to hear the global discussion about your cultural diplomatic outreach. That's very important. Diplomacy in general is based on dialogue. usually between representatives of 2 or more countries. In finding ways to resolve conflict, dialogue is again the key element. Whether the conflict is rooted in ancient hostilities or the result of current circumstances, it is essential to bring the 2 sides together. In cases where the governments are unwilling or unable to meet, Track 2 diplomacy can be very effective. Track 2 may be overseen by diplomats, but it involves engagement between non-governmental representatives on both sides. When members of civil society are brought together to discuss shared interests, it is often possible to find sufficient common ground to move forward. Track 2 diplomacy is extremely useful in situations in which government officials are unable to meet one another directly. Now, some examples specific to certain countries. India and Pakistan. The partition of India and the creation of Pakistan in 1947 were accompanied by an extraordinary level of violence, in which as many as 2 million, figures vary broadly, but as many as 2 million people may have died in interreligious and ethnic conflict. In October of that same year, the Indo-Pakistan War resulted in the division of the disputed region of Kashmir. The War of 1965 was again fought over Kashmir. The War of 1971 resulted in the creation of an independent Bangladesh, formerly East Pakistan, again accompanied by widespread violence. At the time of partition, large numbers of Hindus fled what was to become Pakistan, and large numbers of Muslims fled what was to become independent India. As Bangladesh became independent, many Hindus fled the bloodshed and carnage that was taking place. When I arrived in Lahore, Pakistan in 1984 to serve as the cultural officer at our consulate, I embarked upon my first effort to use cultural diplomacy to heal the wounds of a very bitter conflict. At that time, it was extremely difficult to cross the border between the 2 countries. Although the people of the Punjab on both sides of the border spoke a common language and shared many cultural values, I decided to do a major international conference on a cultural topic of great interest at that time, postmodernism. My idea was to bring Indians and Pakistanis together in Lahore with scholars from Turkey, England, and the US. I flew to New Delhi to personally invite a distinguished Indian literary scholar trained at Yale, a leading Indian poet with Jewish roots, as well as architects and artists and dancers of the postmodernist school. The keynote speaker was the leading American scholar of postmodernism, Ihab Hassan, born in Egypt. 2 Turkish scholars of literature, a British architect, and an American choreographer and dance historian with expertise on Václav Nijinsky's Rite of Spring were among those who participated in the conference. Although it was extremely difficult to negotiate all the permissions with both the Pakistani and Indian authorities, I finally managed to make this happen. The result was extraordinary. When I served as the Counselor for Public Affairs at the American Embassy in Vienna, at the time of the signing of the Dayton Accords in 1995. Sorry, I'll take another sip of water and hope this gets better. The Dayton Accords in 1995, ending the war in former Yugoslavia, we were a platform embassy for our colleagues in the American Embassy at Sarajevo. During the following year and a half, I made 10 trips to Sarajevo and 1 to Tuzla to support reconciliation efforts amongst the formerly warring ethnic groups. The American ambassador in Vienna sponsored a drive called Books for Sarajevo to highlight the need to salvage remains of the magnificent old National Library that had been shelled during the conflict, and to provide books for the new library housed in the former Tito barracks. While this effort was largely symbolic, it drew international attention to the need for reconciliation through scholarship. Another such endeavor involved the donation across Austria of musical instruments for Bosnian children of all ethnicities. The lesson learned here is that visible cultural projects that can be understood by all are a very effective way to win international support for reconciliation. The city of Sarajevo was quite cosmopolitan due to its Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian history. There was considerable intermarriage amongst the various ethnic groups. Many families were forced to flee, not only because of the violence and deprivations of the war, but also because of the tremendous tensions created for those who were not willing or able to clearly identify with one side or the other. The American ambassador decided to embark on an effort at interreligious dialogue, using her home in Vienna as the venue. Representatives from the four communities, Roman Catholic Croats, Bosniak Muslims, Orthodox Serbs, and Sephardic Jews, met on several occasions to walk and talk together in her peaceful gardens. In the end, they hammered out a statement of principles, advocating peace and tolerance to be communicated to each of their respective communities. The lesson here is that religious leaders can influence their followers to adopt tolerance and reject hatred when a conflict has been very bitter. Perhaps the most complicated of these efforts was the tripartite agreement between Bosnia-Herzegovina, Austria, and the US to create a Center for Democracy in Vienna. I negotiated this agreement with the Austrians and the Bosnians on behalf of the American Embassy. Our contribution was to use the Vienna America House Library, an exhibition space for dialogue and cultural events attended by representatives of all four communities in Sarajevo. Bosnian parliamentarians of all ethnicities, writers, journalists, and artists took part in this series of events. Leading international experts such as Richard Goldstone from South Africa, who had sat on the War Crimes Tribunal in The Hague, participated, as did Simon Wiesenthal, the famed Nazi hunter. The lesson here is that it is important to create a neutral venue in which all parties feel comfortable and equal to one another to enable dialogue. The ethnic representatives who met at the Vienna Center for Democracy would not have been able at that time to meet in Sarajevo so soon after the war. This was another form, actually, of Track 2 diplomacy before it was even called Track 2 diplomacy. Turkey and Greece. Turkey and Greece are NATO allies that have come close on several occasions to going to war with one another. Fortunately, thank goodness, this has never happened. Turkey won its War of Independence and defeated Greek armies in Anatolia in 1922. After the signing of the Treaty of Lausanne that ended the war in 1923, there was an exchange of populations done on the basis of religion. Approximately 1.3 million Anatolian Greeks left what is now Turkey for Greece. Approximately 500,000 Muslims in Greece left for what is now Turkey. The victorious Turkish side created the secular Republic of Turkey. On the Greek side, there was a tremendous sense of loss and dislocation. These historic tensions and resentments reached a crisis point in 1999 when Abdullah Öcalan, the founder of the militant Kurdish Workers' Party, or the PKK, was discovered hiding under Greek auspices in Kenya. Öcalan was incarcerated on the island of Imrala and sentenced to death. However, the death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. Relations between Turkey and Greece were completely disrupted. This was a time for Track 2 diplomacy. I was then the counselor for public affairs at the US Embassy in Ankara. Working with diplomats from neutral countries such as Sweden and Austria, we organized a series of meetings between non-governmental leaders from Greece and Turkey in both Istanbul and Athens. Among them were academics, scholars, journalists, and publishers, as well as other influential cultural figures. When these experts got together under the sponsorship of the Swedes or the Austrians, they discovered the many common cultural values they shared. The dialogue was conducted under the direction of a neutral facilitator very experienced in conflict resolution. While all differences were not resolved, the participants on both sides agreed to continue the meetings. The breakthrough came following the horrendous earthquake that struck Izmit in Turkey in 1999. I was in Washington at the time, sitting on a promotion panel. The ambassador immediately called me back. When I returned to Turkey, I was astonished to see the outpouring of assistance from neighboring Greece. The journalists who had participated in the Track 2 meetings had publicized the earthquake so extensively in the media that ordinary people across Greece responded with a helping hand. Aside from earthquake diplomacy, we were also involved in educational projects to diminish the hostility between these two NATO allies. We organized meetings of educators to examine the textbooks on both sides of the border for negative stereotyping. If children are taught to hate their neighbors at a young age, those animosities will remain with them. There was an effort to rewrite textbooks with more even-handed and matter-of-fact accounts of historic events. The lesson to be learned here is the importance of investment in education for tolerance. For many decades, no Greek prime minister had visited Turkey. In 1999, the then Prime Minister, Yorgo Papandreou, a strong believer in reconciliation, was invited to Turkey. One snowy winter evening, he delivered a major speech at the Middle East Technical University in Ankara. The auditorium was filled to overflowing with diplomats, journalists, faculty, and students. When he completed a very eloquent and moving address, he looked at the audience and he asked, "Do you know who wrote that speech?" There was complete silence. You could have heard a pin drop. He waited a moment and said, "That speech was delivered by Eleftherios Venizelos when he was invited to Turkey by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk in 1931. These two charismatic leaders demonstrated a high degree of mutual respect and were able to overcome the sentiments of their respective populations to establish good relations." The lesson to be learned from this is that charismatic leaders can overcome the bitterness engendered by conflict. Prime Minister Papandreou drew upon the example of his predecessor more than half a century earlier to demonstrate that courageous gestures can help to heal the wounds of the past. Israel and the Palestinians. Perhaps no conflict has proved quite so intractable as that between Israelis and Palestinians, all the more so because it has ethnic, territorial, and religious dimensions. Jerusalem is of great importance to people around the world who adhere to the three great monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. For that reason, this conflict has international repercussions in a way that other regional disputes do not. While serving as counselor for public affairs at Embassy Tel Aviv, I was responsible for the Y River Grants, a $10 million project designed to promote Israeli-Palestinian cooperative projects over a 5-year period in the fields of education, culture, health, archaeology, agriculture, water resources, and civil society. The concept behind this grant was that it was important to bring Israelis and Palestinians together to solve mutual problems rather than to have them discuss the divisive political issues that divide them. This was very much a people-to-people endeavor. Educators worked on putting school children together and rewriting textbooks to delete negative stereotypes. Cultural programs promoted musical and other performances in which young people from both communities participated. The health project was operated by Harvard University Medical School's Emergency Medicine Unit, created cooperation between Hadassah Hospital in Jewish West Jerusalem and Augusta Victoria Hospital in Arab East Jerusalem. A Jewish and an Arab scholar produced a book for young people which described the two versions of history, the two narratives, Jewish on one side of the page, Arab on the other. A project to delineate the history of Jerusalem was developed between the Jewish Hebrew University and Arab Al-Quds University. Archaeologists from both communities worked together to unearth the region's rich classical and Ottoman heritage. These and many other cooperative projects were supported by the Y Grant. When I met regularly with the Jewish and Arab participants, they came together in peace to promote better relations between the two peoples. This investment in people and projects to benefit both societies created lasting bonds, so much so that even after one of the many violent incidents that occurred while I was there, the meetings continued. My only regret about the Wye River project is that it came to an end. I hope that in the future it will be renewed. The lesson to be learned from this effort is that people involved in conflict can nevertheless be brought to see the humanity on the other side when engaged in solving mutual problems and meeting common challenges. Okay, I think you all have the text, and I thank you very much for your attention. I was asked to give a rather long presentation today, and I've done so. I would say, in conclusion, returning to the whole question of cultural diplomacy, the questions to be asked are, what are the crucial messages? Who can best convey these messages? What constitutes the audience? Then consider whether the issue should be dealt with via the media, a conference or panel discussion, a lecture tour or cultural program. Think carefully about Ukraine's intellectual traditions, its writers and scholars, about Ukraine's foreign and economic policy experts, about its musicians, dancers, painters, and other artists. What can Ukraine show the world that is powerful and beautiful? Thank you. Thank you so much for your attention.